Our next speaker is Dr. Robert Lustig, who will address processed food, an experiment that failed. Dr. Lustig is professor of pediatrics in the Division of Endocrinology, director of the Weight Assessment for Teen and Child Health Program, and member of the Institute for Health Policy Studies at UCSF. I'd also like to point out that Dr. Lustig was an intern with Dr. Karen Remley, the AAP's CEO and Executive Vice President. But that is not the reason he was selected for this talk. He is studying the interplay between changes in the nutritional environment and defective hormone signaling, in particular, the role of fructose and the lack of fiber in the genesis of the metabolic syndrome. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Robert Lustig.
Thank you, Dr. Mammal. Thank all of you. We're going to switch gears from acute disease to chronic disease. I'm going to start with the fact that today is National Food Day. How appropriate. Another unfunded mandate. You all didn't know that today was Food Day, did you? I have no disclosures. 9 out of every 10 experiments are failures. Those of you who have done science know this. And some of those experiments are social experiments. Witness this one here, declared a failure by Time magazine last year. So I'm going to ask you all to imagine that we have all been unwitting clinical research subjects in a grand research experiment conducted over the last 50 years by 10 principal investigators back in 1965 who posed the following hypothesis. Processed food is better than real food. Now the question is, how do you determine if the experiment was a success or a failure? Well, you have to measure the outcome variables. And in this case, they are consumption, health and disease, the environment, and cash flow. And that has 3 parts: to companies, to consumers, and finally to society. And we will take each one of those in turn. So here's what the experiment started out looking like back in 1966. And I don't know about you, but I ate a lot of those Swanson TV dinners. And here's what it looks like today, and all you have to do is walk down this aisle of your local supermarket. And here are your 10 principal investigators right here, and you've heard of all of them. Okay? If the food has a logo, it's one of these. So what is processed food? Well, it's several food engineering things. It's got to be mass-produced. It's got to be consistent batch to batch, country to country, so that the experience is the same. Specialized ingredients from specialized companies. Virtually all the macronutrients have to be pre-frozen, and that means that the fiber has to be removed because you can't freeze fiber. Has to stay emulsified so that the lasagna, when you put it in the microwave, doesn't separate out. And finally, it has to have very long shelf life or freezer life. So from a nutritional standpoint, what is the difference between processed and real food? Well, 3 things too little and 8 things too much. Not enough fiber. Now, everybody thinks fiber is the stuff you throw in the garbage. But when you consume fiber with your food, such as a piece of fruit, the soluble and insoluble fiber will act as a gel on the inside of your intestine. You can actually see it on electron microscopy, and act as a secondary barrier, preventing the absorption of simple nutrients within the duodenum so that they get delivered further down the jejunum where the microbiome, the intestinal bacteria, will chew them up as well. So even though you consume them, you didn't get them. So a calorie is not a calorie because if you consume it with fiber, it wasn't for you. It was for your bacteria. Omega-3 fatty acids, which are heart-healthy, anti-inflammatory, anti-Alzheimer's. We get this from wild fish, not farmed fish. Micronutrients of various sorts, vitamins, minerals, flavonoids, biotin, etc. And finally, too much trans fats. But we know those are bad, and they're coming out of our diet because the FDA has now declared them not generally recognized safe. Branched chain amino acids, leucine, isoleucine, valine. This is what's in protein powder. This is what athletes use to build muscle. And if you're building muscle, you need those. But what if you're not building muscle? Then they go to your liver, get deamidated, and get turned into liver fat. And they are not under insulin regulation and do not go to glycogen, and they lead to chronic disease. Omega-6 fatty acids. Now, you need those because that's part of the inflammatory response because they're the precursors to arachidonic acid. But When you consume too many of them, you actually end up in a pro-inflammatory state. Additives of various sorts, red dye this, yellow color that, and we know that several of these have been linked to cancer. Emulsifiers, I mentioned before, like for instance, polysorbate 80, carboxymethylcellulose. This is how ice cream stays ice cream. So think about it. What are emulsifiers? Well, they're detergents. They keep fat and water miscible. So what happens if you swallow a detergent? It actually eats through the mucin layer on the intestinal epithelial cell, approximates the bacteria to those epithelial cells, and has been linked to chronic intestinal disease. Too much salt, and we consume 6.9 grams of sodium per day. We're supposed to consume 2.3. Most of us can excrete the excess, but about 15 to 20% of the population is exquisitely salt sensitive and drives hypertension and vascular disease. And nitrates, which we now know cause nitrosoureas and can lead to colon cancer. And finally, the big kahuna, the one that blows all the others out of the water, sugar. We're going to talk a lot about sugar. Why? Because of the 600,000 items in the American food supply, 74% of them are spiked with added sugar for the food industry's purposes, not for yours, because they know when they add it, you buy more. Conversely, of 4,000 packaged items, only 50% of them had greater than the recommendation for added salt. So sugar is the marker for processed food. Now, let's take those outcome variables in turn. First, consumption. So on the left, we have the original White Castle hamburger, 1957. In the middle, we have Bob's Big Boy at 618 calories. And in the midst of this epidemic, we have the Hardee's Thick Burger at 1,420 calories. And I don't know if you've been to Union Square, you can get the Carl's Jr. $6 burger for, that's 2,000 calories. That's the entire caloric allotment of the day. So indeed, our caloric intake is up. No argument. 187 calories in men, 335 calories a day in women, 275 in teen boys, as on this slide. The question is, what are they? Are they fat? No, not fat. In fact, the fat content of our diet has actually stayed the same in absolute terms. And as a percent, it's gone down. You can see here, whole milk way down, meat and cheese about the same, milk desserts up slightly. Bottom line, it's a wash. And as a percent of calories from fat have gone from 40 to 30% because our dietary guidelines told us to, our obesity and metabolic syndrome prevalence has gone through the roof. So what are those calories? Well, they're carbohydrate. 57 grams, 225 calories in teen boys, and there are your carbohydrates there, all through the roof. And of course, beverages, 41% increase in soft drinks, 35% increase in fruit drinks and fruit aids. And what is that? Well, it's this stuff called high fructose corn syrup, the most demonized food additive known to man. But just remember, only the US, Canada, and Japan have it. The rest of the world has the exact same problems we do, and they don't have high fructose corn syrup, but they sure do have its cousin sucrose. And that's the problem. So here's high fructose corn syrup on the top, 1 glucose, 1 fructose. The fructose is the sweet molecule. It's the molecule we seek. It's the molecule that's addictive, and it's the molecule that's handled differently by the liver. Notice sucrose, 1 glucose, 1 fructose, O-glycosidic linkage, linking the two. So what? The enzyme sucrase in your intestine cleaves this in about a nanosecond. You absorb the two moieties. Bottom line, they're the same. No difference. The only reason high fructose corn syrup is a bigger problem is because it's cheaper. And because it's cheaper, it made sugar cheaper because of competition, and that let sugar enter all of our food because when we took the fat out of the food, we added sugar for palatability. So here's what happened to our sugar consumption over the last 200 years. Our ancestors getting sugar from the ground, fruits and vegetables, the occasional honey, consumed about 4 pounds per year. Currently, we consume about 90 pounds per year, and you can see where processed food entered the issue in 1965. Now let's take the second of those outcome variables, health and disease. So this is from the New England Journal, and it's looking at preventable causes of death. And what you can see is that smoking is down, blood pressure down, cholesterol down, physical activity up. We should be reaping a health benefit, and we're not, because obesity is up and diabetes is absolutely off the charts. In fact, diabetes is going up way faster than obesity is. Here's the reason, and it's on this slide. This is Coca-Cola's Coming Together campaign from 2013. It was on all the football games, the Super Bowls. I guarantee you saw it. And they say, beating obesity will take action by all of us based on one simple common sense fact: all calories count, no matter where they come from, including Coca-Cola and everything else with calories. So, as far as they're concerned, you can get your calories from carrots, or you can get your calories from cheesecake, or you can get your calories from Coca-Cola, or you can get your calories from kumquats. Doesn't matter, because a calorie is a calorie. If you eat more than you burn, you will gain weight. If you eat less than you burn, you will lose weight. Therefore, it's energy balance. Therefore, it's you eat too much, you exercise too little. Therefore, it's diet and exercise. Therefore, if you're fat, it's your fault. Therefore, any calorie can be part of a balanced diet. Therefore, don't pick on our calories, go pick on somebody else's calories. And all of that comes from a calorie is a calorie. And after all, it's common sense. Well, I don't believe in common sense. I'm a scientist. I believe in data. And the science says something else, because some calories cause disease more than others, because different calories are metabolized differently, because a calorie is not a calorie. And I've already shown you when it's consumed with fiber, it's not a calorie because you didn't get it. Here's a histogram of the NHANES database for adults, and the median of this histogram is at 18% of calories per day as added sugar for the adult American population. In the center of that graph is a red line, which is the hazard risk ratio for heart disease death, cardiovascular mortality, for the same population over the same period of time. And you'll notice that the inflection point is at 15%. So what does that mean? That means that more than half the US population has an increased risk of dying of a heart attack because of their added sugar consumption. And if you happen to be out on the right edge of that graph, at 30 to 32%, which is where our teenagers are, the hazard risk ratio is 4. So if you think we've got a problem with heart disease now, just wait till our teenagers are in the emergency room when they're 30s and they're 40s. Basically, there won't be any access to health care because they'll be in all the gurneys. This is a study done out of Europe, the EPIC Interact study, their version of NHANES, where they looked at the question, do sugar beverages predict diabetes? And the answer in the red boxes, when you adjust for energy intake, because after all, if it's about calories, then it shouldn't matter where the calories come from. So you have to adjust for energy intake, and they adjusted for obesity, BMI. Every sugared sweetened beverage increased risk for diabetes by 29%. And in America, we don't consume 1 sugar beverage a day, we consume 2.5. So take that up to 68%. This was a meta-analysis looking at soda on the top and fruit juice on the bottom, because there are a lot of people who say fruit juice is good for you because it's got vitamin C. Take a friggin' pill. Because it doesn't matter if it's soda or fruit juice, when you adjust for adiposity in the second to last column, it's above 1 no matter what. This is a study we published earlier this year where we took the entire NHANES adolescent database and looked at their added sugar consumption and divided everyone up into quintiles. So the first quintile was the reference range at 30 grams per day, and you can see the 5th quintile going all the way out. And we asked the question, does added sugar in their diet predict their risk for metabolic syndrome, exclusive of their calories and exclusive of obesity? And you can see the answer on this slide very clearly, yes. We also looked at the rest of the world, and we asked the question, does the added sugar in the diet, or actually does anything in the diet, predispose any given country to diabetes? And it turned out that calories didn't matter. For every extra 150 calories that were available in any given country per person per day, diabetes prevalence went up a total of 0.1%. Nothing. But if those 150 calories happened to be a can of soda instead, diabetes prevalence went up 11-fold. 1.1%. And again, we're not drinking 1, we're drinking 2.5. So take that up to 29% for America. These data actually meet the criteria for causal medical inference. So who here believes in global warming? Why? Got a control group? Who here believes that football injuries cause chronic traumatic encephalopathy? Why? Got a control group? Who here believes that tobacco causes lung cancer? Why? Got a control group? You can't do these studies. They're impossible, illegal, and unethical. Do you think we can actually take a group of naive people and start them on a high sugar versus low sugar diet and watch them for the next 50 years knowing what they eat and see whether or not somebody gets heart disease? Really? You think we can do that? Bottom line is this is called causal medical inference. The Bradford Hill criteria for causal medical inference, we have the same level of proof as for tobacco and lung cancer. And actually now we have even better because now we have interventional data. So this was our study that we published this past year and also this year where we took 43 children with metabolic syndrome, figured out what they ate at home, studied them at baseline, and then catered their meals for 10 days, no added sugar. So we took about 350 to 400 calories per day out of their diet. Well, if you do that, then they're going to lose weight, right? So we had to give them back 350 to 400 calories in starch. A starch for sugar exchange with no change in weight to ask the question, is sugar dangerous beyond its calories? Everybody got it? So we took the pastries out, we put the bagels in. We took the sweetened yogurt out, we put the baked potato chips in. We took the chicken teriyaki out, we put the turkey hot dogs in, okay, for 10 days, then we restudied them. Every aspect of their metabolic health improved with no change in weight. And here are all the fasting labs. You can see all the red on the p-values there. Here's their glucose tolerance test. They're getting more starch, they're getting more glucose. Their glucose should be going higher. No, it's not. It's going lower because now they're insulin sensitive. And you can see that on the right because that's an insulin resistance curve on the top and that's an insulin sensitive curve on the bottom because we fixed their metabolic dysfunction. We also measured how fast their liver was turning the sugar into liver fat by giving them C13 labeled acetate to see whether or not it turned into palmitate. And you can see here's what happened on day 0, all the fat being made in the liver, and you can see that it got cut in half in 10 days. And here's what happened to their body fat. Subcutaneous fat on the right, no change because there was no change in weight. Visceral fat down 7%, and liver fat down 22% in 10 days with no change in calories and no change in weight. And we now have the data that shows it's the liver fat that drives the insulin resistance, drives the metabolic dysfunction, drives the metabolic syndrome. So we now have causative data for sugar and diabetes, sugar and heart disease, sugar and fatty liver disease, and sugar and tooth decay. We have correlative data for sugar and cancer and sugar and dementia. We do not have causative data yet. We're working on it. And for those of you who still don't believe because you've been told for the last 50 years that a low-fat diet is good for you, 1 month ago, my colleagues at UCSF, Kristen Carnes, Laura Schmidt, and Stan Glantz, published this paper in JAMA Internal Medicine, which shows that the entire low-fat industry is based on a sham, based on being the Harvard School of Public Health being paid off to produce 2 review articles in the New England Journal that exonerated sugar and said that saturated fat was the problem. Look it up. Now let's do environment. So the World Wildlife Federation says, you know what, sugar is actually not too good for the environment because it causes soil erosion, so it causes difficulties in terms of being able to grow certain crops. It also contributes to global warming. 40% of global warming is due to agriculture for processed food. Here's what's going on in the Everglades, where you see light orange, yellow, or green, that's sugar plantations, and Lake Okeechobee is now contaminated, and they know it because when the flood happened, that's what happened to Fort Myers. So here's corn planting in 2007. That's not too surprising to you. On the upper right is atrazine use. In the bottom right is nitrate contamination, and my favorite is the bottom left, the ratio of government payments to farm gross income. What do you see? So my question to you, what is the dirtiest four-letter word in the English language? Iowa. Because Iowa is the first presidential caucus. You can't win the presidency if you don't win Iowa. Did you hear that, Donald Trump? It's the third rail of American politics. And finally, cash flow. First to companies. So here's how our food dollars have changed over the years. Meats, down 10% because we were all told to go low fat. Fruits and vegetables, exactly the same, no change. Now, we're always told we don't eat enough fruits and vegetables, and indeed, that's true. We never did. It ain't new. But we didn't have this problem before, but we sure do have it now, because it's not about the fruits and vegetables. Grains and baked goods, up 1%, and that's a problem because that's refined carbohydrate, that's insulin, that's weight gain. Dairy products, down 2.5% because now we're all lactose intolerant. And here's the big one, processed foods and sweets from 11.6 to 22.9%, a doubling in the span of 30 years. There's your smoking gun. And here's the S&P 500 in blue, and there's the stock price of McDonald's, Coke, and Pepsi. Notice they were doing pretty well up to 2011. This got turned, and I apologize, but it's also all the other processed food companies, Hormel, ADM, General Mills, ConAgra, Kraft, all doing better than the S&P. But the word is out on Wall Street, and in the last 2 years, Big Sugar has taken a beating, as you can see, by Sudzucker, Ilovo, and Tate & Lyle, now all of a sudden doing less well than the S&P, and there's Dr. Pepper, Snapple, Coke, and McDonald's. All of a sudden not doing so well because the word is out. And finally, consumers. If you look at the right, you can see less healthy processed food. It's half the price, and it's going up slower than the healthy food. Why? Because it's subsidized. Corn, wheat, soy, and sugar are subsidized. We spend the least amount of any country on food, 6.7%, compared to, look at the countries in purple at 36%. They've all been in revolution in the last 4 years, and don't think that's not why. But you'd say, well, that would be a good deal for the consumer. It's cheaper. Well, there's the hospital costs in red, there's the physician costs in green, and there's the pharma costs in purple. Take a look at what it's costing total, and that's for chronic metabolic disease. It's a bad deal long term. And finally, to society. Remember this slide? Now I'm going to overlay on it the percent of GDP spent on health care for the same period of time. What do you notice? We introduced processed food, and that's when health care started to rise. The food industry grosses $1.5 trillion a year, of which $550 billion is gross profit. But healthcare in America costs $3.2 trillion a year, of which 75% is chronic disease, of which 75% is preventable. That's $1.8 trillion a year wasted. We lose triple what the food industry makes. This is unsustainable, and that's why Medicare and Social Security are going broke. In fact, Credit Suisse knows this, and they came out in favor of taxation. An international investment bank called it for food taxation. What's up with that? That's how big and bad this problem has gotten. And here's Morgan Stanley projecting out what economic growth will look like to the year 2035 based on a low sugar case and a high sugar case. And for the high sugar case, we're at 0.0% economic growth. I'll pass on these. So imagine that the last 50 years were an experiment. Let's do the scorecard. Consumption, way up. Health and disease, a complete and utter disaster. If this had been an IRB protocol, it would have been stopped decades ago for all of the excess deaths. Environment, clear negative, and finally cash flow. For companies, good previously, not so good recently. For consumers, good short term, terrible long term, and finally to society, a big fat 0.0 economic growth. Processed food is an experiment that failed. The only answer, real food. That's what we used to eat. . But the problem is that's not what those 10 PIs are selling. We are pediatricians. Anticipatory guidance is our purview. It's our job. Make this job one. Thank you.